My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for the larger delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, which is about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets the call for the job while he is chilling with his Navajo friend, Travis, and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock that he hasn't seen in ages and suggests they go with him. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was the summertime, so Dad decides we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, and then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out the Window Rock, which is, for those who don't know, a big rock face with a large hole in it that goes to the other side. It's pretty cool. We had to convoy in separate trucks since my dad's was loaded down with freight. We decided to bring along some talkie-talkies so we could communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock. Everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my father and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in their truck behind us. I honestly don't remember most of Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. We're somewhere on the highway between Window Rock and Gallup. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the road was kind of slick, so we were taking it pretty slow. On the left side of the highway there is nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right side there is a huge field separated from the road by a small barbed wire fence. We crest the top of this hill, and down at the bottom of the hill, we see what appears to be a very large dog just sitting back on its haunches in the middle of the road, facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio, "Hey Travis, do you see that big-ass dog?" Travis starts yelling back over the radio, "That is not a dog, speed up right now and hit it." He sounds almost hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it! You have to hit it, please, please, hit that fucking thing right now." So, my dad starts to speed up, and as we get a bit closer, I begin to see it a little more clearly. It's covered in this brown, wiry, matted hair that appears to have dried blood all over it. It's still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and looks right at us, and it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than a mix between a bear's and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted and almost in pain. As we get closer to this thing, we start to realize it's actually pretty huge. Though it was still sitting on its haunches, it is about shoulder height with the hood of the truck. We get literally inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like someone screaming as their lungs were filling with water, and it leaps backwards, towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence. Then, with another leap, it was gone from sight. Travis's comes in over the radio again. "Holy shit, keep driving, we have to get out of here, we have to go faster." He kept repeating that last part, "We have to get out of here, and we have to go faster." Pretty soon, we are speeding like crazy, and just as we start to come near the outskirts of Gallup, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us. Naturally, this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull over as well. Travis says, "We just saw a Skinwalker a few miles back, and it's been following us." The officer immediately turns white, stammers something about a verbal warning, gets in his car and takes off. We do the same. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us leave without taking some kind of Navajo totem thing that was supposed to keep it away. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things, namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here's my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona that's kind of sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S. largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we traveled a lot on the Navajo reservation, and we also usually stayed at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning, but this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our big game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out, and it wasn't long, about 2 hours of driving before we had entered the res. And by this time, everyone was asleep with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles an hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. But for some reason, I just couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desolate desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of a pursuit, and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles an hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. I immediately thought, oh my god, it's a Skinwalker. The Skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, hurdling sagebrush and rocks while staring right at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The Skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhumane smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked yellow pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking throughout the whole ordeal. The Skinwalker started to crumble down on all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform. Hair started appearing all over the Skinwalker's body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. I saw him the next school day in the parking lot. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter-like thing. Turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another Skinwalker since. It might be due to the fact I moved away from that town and the res. And if I do have to go south, I go around. Way around. This all happened about 5 or so years ago. One night, a few of my friends decided after a night of hanging out that we'd go on an adventure at about 3 a.m. We took a ride about 50 miles to this old Spanish ruins in New Mexico. That was once the seat of the Inquisition. I can't for the life of me remember what the place is called, but anyway. So we jumped the front gate to the palace and started exploring. One of my friends brought a flute with him, and he started playing it, and about 30 seconds into his mediocre playing, something started screaming really, really loud on the tops of the long destroyed walls of the place. It was going from wall to wall really quick, screaming the most blood-curdling scream you've ever imagined. We noped the fuck out of there, and one of my friends pissed his pants and drove for a few hours to Bandelier National Monument, where we planned to camp out for the rest of the weekend. We got to Bandelier at probably like 6 or 7 a.m., and then we set up our camp. After a few hours just talking about what the hell happened at the ruins, I went to take a piss behind it, probably only like 300 feet from our camp. This is where everything starts getting a little fuzzy. I remember seeing 2 dust devils coming my way, and when I turned around again, 2 of my friends were there, and they were motioning me to follow them. I couldn't help but to follow them, like I was being pulled behind them in shackles. I followed them for what seemed like 10 or 15 minutes, and then I snapped out of it. These weren't my friends. They had bright red hair with my friends' faces and cat eyes. Both of these friends were brunette. I stopped walking and they looked at me with probably the most terrifying gaze I've ever seen. Monsters in movies are nothing compared to this. I turned around and ran as fast as I could back the way I came from. After like 5 minutes of a full sprint, I got back to that rock that I pissed at and found our camp. Everybody was sitting there, still sitting around, talking, and didn't even notice that I was even gone. I told them what had happened with the look-alike skinwalkers, and we packed up everything and left probably within like 10 minutes and got the hell back to Albuquerque. I was a kid when this happened. My uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother because it was getting dark. Driving back on a dirt road at about 30 miles an hour, give or take 5 miles an hour. I had this awful sense of just being watched. Before I could turn to look out my window, which was the passenger side, my uncle quickly shouted, "Don't!" I completely froze. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest and then completely stopped when I heard a tap-tap on my window. My uncle sped up and was loudly praying in my native language. I didn't know what was going on and thought it was over till our truck suddenly dipped from the bed. My uncle then started saying, "Look at me, and don't turn away," over and over. Then I heard it again, tap, tap, but from the window behind me. It was getting harder for me to breathe, and I wanted to cry. A minute or two passed, and the truck dipped again. My uncle looked around and sighed. It was quiet besides the truck and the road. He looked at me and said, "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." Basically, that's the Navajo to English equivalent of what he had said. I remember curling up on the seat and just staring at the radio, watching the time go by, listening to my uncle sing an old prayer till we got to my grandmother's house. I called my uncle because I had a nightmare about that night. We talked about it for a bit, and he said, "I didn't see faces, just the eyes. Like brake lights you see on the road, it watched you." Before hanging up, I tried joking with him about it. "Why didn't you just step on the brake when it was in the back?" No laughter, just a pause from him. "Because it wasn't alone." As many of you might already know, many Navajo people, including my own family, are very reluctant to speak about skinwalkers because it is believed to attract their attention. Well, I, however, grew up away from the Navajo Nation and was very naive about the subject. When it came to skinwalkers, I was an absolute skeptic. My mom used to tell me a story of how back in the 80s, when she lived with her siblings and my grandparents, still in Shiprock, but the southern outskirts, about how she and my aunt saw a skinwalker just outside their driveway under a streetlight. She described it as a black dog with dirty fur, a twisted noodle-like front leg, and these unnatural eyes with a soft, burnt orange glow. Me, being my own closed-minded self, doubted every word, but I never said my doubts aloud. But these doubts totally changed last year when I went to my grandparents' house last October. Me and my family had just finished scourging the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair and called it a night. The house was close enough where we could walk home in just 10 minutes, so we did. When we got there, it was about 9 at night, where we stayed up until about 2, catching up about family affairs and the local news. It was during that time that I had just decidedly opened my mouth and blurted out the question, "Hey, are skinwalkers real? Guys?" I asked. "You shouldn't be speaking about that," my grandma said with almost a disturbed yell in her voice. So she and my grandfather both decide to go to bed. After being scolded by my mom, one of my aunts chimes in with a very cautious tone and says, "They're real, all right. Had a few start screaming outside of my trailer in Farmington just a few nights ago. Your cousin had nightmares the whole night and woke up crying that morning." Not wanting to push the discomfort any further, we all decided to go to bed at this point. Now, the trailer/home is pretty old and it was a really nice night. So we slept with the windows open, the screens to prevent bugs coming in, of course. Everyone at this point had drifted off to sleep except me. Well, because my mind was still just going a million miles a minute about skinwalkers and wondered if I ever encounter one while here on the reservation. As a kid, I was told it's taboo to think about skinwalkers because it can still call their attention. That's when shit totally hit the fan for me. Just as I was settling and finally getting relaxed for sleep, I started to hear something moving outside. I get up from the couch and start wandering over to the kitchen window. In the trailer, all of the rooms have the lights out, so the only visible light that can be seen is from the porch light out front. I was thankful for this because I told myself if it really was a skinwalker outside, then hopefully it wouldn't notice me seeing it. So I muster up the courage and take a quick scan of outside. From the porch light, all I can see is the dusty ground and the vehicles that my family drove along with some of the old metal trash cans that stood beside the road. Looking for about a good 5 seconds, I wasn't able to see anything, so I was getting ready to turn around and walk back to bed, thinking it was just a stray cat or something. Only have taken 2 steps. I hear what sounds like a distorted scream coming from outside, definitely close by. The fear rising in me, I look outside again, and there I see it for the first time. A coyote-like figure was staring at my direction from behind the cars, just outside of the reach of the porch light. Only it looked awfully wrong and gave off an evil vibe just from seeing it. It was gray with very disheveled hair, and a horrific orange-red soft glow came from its eyes. I noped the hell out and ran back to the bedroom. It was at this moment I had begun to also notice an awful stench in the air that smelled kind of like rotting meat. I started trying to wake up my mother, who was like, "Oh my God, it's almost 3 a.m., what do you want?" I immediately began in a shaken voice, "There's something scary outside." And then she said, now annoyed because I woke her up, "Ugh, it's probably just a stray animal or something. It's the res. Animals wander all the time at night." She obviously wasn't getting the drift of what I was saying, so I screamed, "There's some Blair Witch Project shit going on outside, Ma." Well, that got her attention. What are you talking about?" she said, and then we heard it. The thing outside started making more of its dreadful like screams and started what sounded like thrashing outside on the ground. Hear that? That's what I'm talking about. So both her and I got back up and looked outside the window, and the coyote thing was making its way to the door. It walked with an odd limp and dragged its back right leg as if it was a handicap. We could hear it start to scratch against the door and make this odd, muffled moaning sound. My mom went and got my dad, and they both started shouting in Navajo all sorts of words, telling the thing to go away and saying it's not welcome here. Well, all this commotion was enough to get the rest of the trailer up as they came out into the hallway. The only thing my mom did was turn to them and said, "Skinwalker," while proceeding to point to the door, while the noises were still happening. Apparently, they already knew exactly what to do as my grandfather got out a handgun from the drawer and a bag of ashes. He coated a few bullets and loaded them into the gun and went straight to the door. Yelling out more Navajo that was too fast for me to even comprehend, he swung open the door and fired twice. Nothing. The thing managed to escape before my grandpa could even put a bullet in it. "That's the fastest one I've ever seen," said my grandpa. Next thing you know, my aunts and my parents are freaking out about what had just happened, saying stuff like, "What if it comes back tomorrow?" And "It saw us, does that mean we're targets now?" Afterwards, my grandparents calmed everyone down, myself included, saying that we'll be fine, and we all went to bed about 3-ish. Morning comes, and my grandparents call one of their neighbors and explain to them what had happened. Apparently, one of them was a medicine man who used to partake in Navajo ceremonies used for healing and curing sickness, and came over to bless each family member and the grounds outside. This is my father's story, written from his perspective. When I was about 11 or 12, we lived in a small house made of mud and stone. a lot like our house now. It was two of my brothers and I in the house. Everyone else had gone to Jimmy's Fest and left us to tend the sheep. We were getting ready for bed when we heard the dogs going crazy outside. Thinking it was nothing more than just coyotes howling in the distance, we told them to be quiet. We began to drift off into sleep and the dogs would not shut up. Somehow, I was able to go to sleep for a few hours. But then I woke up very late in the night. It was very quiet and still in the house, save for my brother snoring and breathing. I realized I needed to use the outhouse and woke up my brother to take me there. He teased me about being scared, which I certainly was. We went out with our flashlight to the outhouse, and the dogs began with their crazed barking in the sagebrush, going from one place to the next. My brother went first, and I waited outside for him. While waiting, I tried to follow the dogs with my flashlight. Suddenly, there was a very loud whine from one of the dogs, and then everything went quiet again. It was really too quiet for that time of year, to be honest. Not even the sheep were making any noises. Suddenly, I heard a few of the dogs going completely mad by the truck, and when I looked over, there was this man. He was unbelievably tall, leaning one arm on the cab roof of the truck. He was looking at the dogs for a little, and then suddenly kicking one of them. They all scattered in different directions. The thing looked up at me, and I saw its face. It had a pure white face, like a full moon, two burning red eyes, and a slight smile that was pure black. I could not move or make a sound. It began to walk toward me with a long stride, until it finally towered over me. All I began to see was a dark red, like the color of the blood when you cut the throat of a sheep. I kept getting deeper and deeper into its eyes. I could faintly hear my brother coming out of the outhouse. With this, the thing looked up at him. Reality came rushing back to me. I noticed that my brother was too distracted with his buckle to realize what was even going on. I also noticed this thing's long hands hovering just inches from my head. Its skin was black ash, and he smelled like a bloated dead animal in summer. I was still unable to move or speak. The Skinwalker began to move toward my brother. Finally, noticing this figure, my brother became paralyzed as I was. Closer and closer it drew, reaching an arm outward toward my brother's head. And something finally snapped in me. I became unbearably angry. I broke from the trance and lunged at the Skinwalker, raising my arms like a wild animal and baring my teeth at it. A growl came out that I never knew I could make. I became more and more angry at the thing that was trying to hurt us. It kept that smile at first, but the angrier I got, the more that smile faded. Finally, with everything I had, I began to make this primal roar at it. It fell backwards and ran into the night. Looking back at me, its eyes were dim and dull, its smile now long gone since what had happened. The next morning, the family returned home from the feast. After relaying the story to my parents, they quickly hired a medicine man. Whenever my mom would take us on a road trip to her hometown on the Navajo reservation, I'd occasionally ask her to tell me a Skinwalker story along the way. I remember every story she's told me when we were driving through miles of nothing at night. Luckily, nothing ever happened to us during those drives. Anyway, this is one of those stories, and it came from my auntie. So my auntie and some of her friends used to party a lot back in the day. They'd hop up in a beaten-down van and drive out to the boondocks and just drink and have fun. Of course, this all took place on the Navajo reservation after sunset. And on this particular night, that's what they were doing. Everything was going good and whatnot when all of a sudden, they hear what sounds like rocks being thrown at their van. Everybody gets quiet as they wonder what the hell is going on. The sounds of rocks being thrown stops, and then suddenly, something jumps on top of the van roof. I should mention my family owned a white van that we would use for road trips because it had enough room for all of my brothers and me. So imagine a young me being told this story in a van. Terrifying. Everybody starts panicking as the realization sets in and hurry to lock every door. My auntie jumps in the driver's seat and tries to start the engine. But of course, the beaten down van refuses to start up. Whatever is on the roof is still up there making banging noises, and at this point, like it's jumping up and down. My auntie is freaking out when she then sees a hand with long nails reach over the roof and start scratching the windshield. At this point in the story, my mom would take one hand off the steering wheel and scratch the windshield to simulate it. Then, whatever was on the roof jumps off. Everyone is still freaking out, yelling at my auntie to start the van, and she keeps trying. And that's when she sees the Skinwalker walk up to the driver's side window and stare at her just a few inches away. Well, that's when my auntie jumped in the back and started praying for her life. Minutes pass and the Skinwalker appears to leave. My auntie hops back in the driver's seat and gets the van to start, and off they go. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was, though, opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure just drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off of the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were luckily returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun, and my grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed a ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandmother chased my aunt inside and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after this thing, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on the particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. But not only that, but whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her, and to leave his family alone. A few days had passed, and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the Skinwalker is and say their name, it will kill them. So, no clue if it's applicable here, but I figured y'all would get a kick out of this. Let's preface. My memory is shitty, so I can't give enough details to confirm for all of you, but this is what I can give. When I was younger than 10, maybe around 8 or 9, I was living in an apartment complex in Seymour, Indiana. A nice little place. I was playing with some friends of mine at the attached playground of the complex when I swore I heard my mother calling for me to come over. But it wasn't from the direction I knew she was at, but instead from the opposite direction. I was confused, so I told them I would be back, and I spoke to my mom, who was smoking with my aunt and my grandmother. I asked her what she needed, and she was confused and saying, "I didn't say anything, Bubba. Go ahead and keep playing." So I went back and went about my business, not hearing the voice again. I swear up and down, though, that it was her voice. A few years down the road, I was watching an episode of Found Tapes, that old mockumentary show that used to air on Animal Planet. It was the Skinwalker episode, and I remember feeling a chill down my spine as the event from my childhood went through my head once more. At that moment, I felt I had narrowly avoided an encounter with one of these things. I don't have any records of hallucinations, and the place where my mom was smoking was at least a good 3 to 4 minute walk away from the playground. Can't really say on the matter of this if it was a real encounter, but I figured it was enough to finally post it on the internet. I hope you guys find this interesting, and I'll answer as many questions as I can. Winter of 2017. Around December, if I remember right. I was camping with friends right outside of the Paiute Reservation near St. George, Utah. None of us are native, but we were trying very hard to be respectful of the land. We set up an A-frame, and every night packed in like sardines. I was on the outside, and my buddy Seth was next to me. Coyotes are pretty common in this part of the country, but they're pack animals who don't really engage with campers, so it's very common to hear them, but not as common to see them up close. However, every night that week we saw this mangled old coyote. Gray hair, blistering skin, probably on the edge of death. It walked with a limp in its front left paw, kind of like a dog that gets a pebble stuck in their paw meat. Anyway, we went to bed one night, and I was still in on the edge. Around 3:15 in the morning, I woke up with a sharp pain in my ear. It ended up being a beetle burrowing in my ear, but that's not important. Anyway, I hit the side of my head and pressed my ear, and I was freaking out because it was a really acute pain that I had never felt before. I think I thought I was having an aneurysm. Anyway, I woke Seth up to have him shine a light in my ear, and as soon as he woke up, he legit pissed his pants. Like he was horrified. So my chest opens up, and I'm like, "What is it?" He reached above his head and gets a mirror, and holds it up to me, and to my horror, there's a scraggly old man. Gray hair, huge tumor on the side of his face, torn up clothes, walking with a cane and a limp. He doesn't seem to be at all cognizant of us, almost as if he was in a different dimension. We didn't have a gun or anything, so we just clutched our knives and kept our eyes on him for the rest of the night. He just wandered away at one point. The next morning, the 2 other people with us said that they both dreamt that this kid Chris, who wasn't with us, was tied to a tree, upside down, and a massive, silver-glowing elk slowly but surely gutted him alive with its horns. They said the 4 of us and a few of other friends all sat naked around the tree, not drumming or chanting, but almost like we were sacrificing Chris. They both had exactly the same dream and were able to draw the same picture, down to the order we were sitting in to the number of branches on the tree without consulting each other. We texted Chris when we had left and got service, and he said he had been up all night puking. Was this a skinwalker? So, my father used to be a federal judicial officer for the Mexican government, and his jurisdiction would change from time to time on a case-by-case basis. He was very young and passing by a village around 8 p.m. when they stopped at a cantina for some food to continue on the road ahead. Back then, only sheriffs or very top officials had vehicles, but the rest of us had to use public transportation to get around. Except for them, it was free at least. They stopped to eat and make conversation with the locals when an older gentleman asked where they were going, and my father says there's no buses or taxis in this village. He and his friends were planning to walk about an hour and a half to the next town that was down a dirt road. The old man looked surprised and asked, "You're going through there right now? Don't you know the story?" To which my father replies, "No, they're not from that area, and it's just a simple walk, no problem. And besides, they were armed, so they laughed it off." The old man seemed a bit pensive when he continued and told them that there was a story from the village that people don't walk that road at night because of 3 demon pigs. My dad and his buddies laughed, but the old man was not amused. He was serious. He began to tell them that people have walked down that road at night and have gone missing, and that he and others have seen the cause. 3 demon pigs. My dad laughed again, but the old man ignored him. He went on to say that when he was younger, he had a run-in with said pigs. He said it was late at night and was walking back home to his village on the old dirt road from his cousin's the next town over when he suddenly heard a voice. He turned to see 3 pigs, black hair like that of a warthog and eyes as black as night. He couldn't see the natural reflection of light that animal eyes usually had and was come over with a sense of dread and fear. And so they began to speak and laugh. The man was terrified and couldn't muster the will to move. They spoke vile things about this man's family and spoke of a gruesome death, each pig speaking with a different tone. Once he was able to muster movement, the man sprinted back non-stop back to his cousin's house, where he got himself together and didn't go out for the rest of the night. My dad listened, as he's respectful, and didn't say anything smart this time, but still insisted he was going to walk the dirt path with his buddies as he had to. And so the old man offered him a ride there, free of charge, saying he didn't want them walking there at night, whether they believed him or not. And that is the end of my father's recounting. This story happened to my cousin, who was visiting our grandmother on the Navajo Nation reservation. He was what you would call an urban Navajo, born and raised in Phoenix and rarely visited the reservation. He was raised in the church and was aware of certain Navajo taboos and folklore, but didn't heed any or abide by any. Him and his older brother used to stay at our grandmother's during the summer and help out with chores and livestock. They called it sheep camp. However, sheep camp was a summer lodge or cabin in the mountains where you took the sheep during the summer months to graze. Being from the city, I guess, they just liked the term sheep camp, when in reality it was just our grandmother's permanent residence. Like most rural residences on the reservation, old automobiles and appliances that no longer work piled up in the front yards due to a lack of transportation or waste management options. There was an obsolete refrigerator from the 80s on the far left side of my grandmother's porch, and a broken-down muscle car from decades earlier. The car was more of a skeleton, a forgotten remnant, that rested about 30 feet far off to the left in perfect eye-line sight from the porch. The model of the car I cannot remember, but the windows had all been busted out, and the upholstery weathered and cracked. The desert sand reclaimed most of it. The tires were shredded and half buried. If you grew up on the reservation, this served as a derelict jungle gym or playground. My mother and I had decided to visit my grandmother one summer afternoon when I was 12 years old, the same age as my cousin. We greeted everyone upon our arrival, and my grandmother fed us. My cousin asked if I wanted to take a walk to the canyon and told me he had something to tell me with urgency. As soon as we were out of earshot of any adults or his older brother, he had told me something had happened earlier that day, around 5:30 a.m. Although it was summer, in the Arizona temperate desert, it is easily many degrees colder at night and early mornings. He told me he was awoken by the urge to relieve himself. The sky was dark blue before the dawn. He was half asleep, and it was too cold to run all the way to the outhouse. No inside plumbing. So he continued to say he darted to the left to pee behind the old refrigerator and off the porch. His eyes were half closed and his mind still a bit hazy from just waking up. Then he hears the distinct sound of something jagged and sharp scratching in long successions on metal, accompanied by with the heightened whimpering of a sheepdog. His eyes open wide and he tries to scan the horizon to locate the origins of the hurt sheepdog. Initially, he thought he saw the dog trapped in the car, but there were no windows or glass obstructing the dog's escape from the wreckage. He witnessed the dog clawing and scratching to fight its way out of the window frame of the driver's side, its front paws clawing at the outer shell of the driver's door, making the sound of nails on a chalkboard. He finished urinating and dazedly took one step off the porch to help the dog out of the car. Suddenly, he freezes in his tracks as a cold, wicked laugh rips through the early dawn air. His eyes immediately fixate on where the laugh originated from, inside the car. He rubs his eyes and focuses his gaze on the dog, and his eyes follow along the dog's torso. And then he sees that something has its arms and claws wrapped around the waist of the dog, preventing it from escaping. At this point, the sun had inched and crept over the mesa and turned the sky from a pale blue to a pale yellow. The pale yellow light reveals that the driver's side of the car is completely covered in smeared blood. He jolts back inside and bolts the door behind him. He doesn't tell anyone because he was paralyzed with fear. Fear that if he talked about it, nothing would stop it from busting in the door and killing him, his brother, and our grandmother. I inquired about what it looked like, or if he even saw what had been holding the dog against its will. He said it looked like a werewolf, but a sickly werewolf with mange. He noted that it was hairy, but you could see almost dry, cracked gray skin underneath. He said before he ran, he slouched down to see what was holding the dog inside the car, and whatever it was grinned. Its wicked smile was filled with sharp, jagged teeth beaming from side to side. In all honesty, I thought he was lying to me and trying to scare me, thinking I was some dumb, uncivilized rezzer who would believe a werewolf tale. We spent some time in the canyon playing on boulders and throwing rocks into a small stream. I had all but forgotten what he shared with me, until we made it back to my grandmother's house. That's when he asked if I wanted to see the scene of the crime. I was skeptical at the time, until we walked up to the car in question. I couldn't believe it. There were tufts of bloody, multicolored dog fur caught in the window frame, and the bloody paw prints and smears on the outside of the driver door. There were long scratch marks from the dog everywhere. Not sharp enough to cut through the metal, but enough to make a slight indent, as if the nails were scratching down with so much pressure that the protein from the nails, or whatever nails are made of, buckled and gave way, filed down on the metal. I stood there in amazement and fear. All we did was throw dirt on the blood markings, and I haven't spoken of it until right now. Side note, the sheepdog wasn't murdered. We spent all late afternoon looking for her. The dog was a female. We later found her under an abandoned manufactured home on the property. She was afraid to come out for a couple weeks, so my cousin said he always brought her food and water for the remainder of the summer break. Hey guys, so I need to give some background info. I'm a 14-year-old girl from Texas. I have Asperger's, and that will be relevant later. From when I was very young, I would wander alone in the woods or general wild areas. I am very aware of sounds and smells. One of my earliest memories of something I couldn't rationalize at the time started with a very potent odor. It smelled like rotting meat mixed with, I know this is weird, but perfume. I had been in the woods alone, picking wild onions and flowers, when I smelt it. The area was very, very old, an abandoned settlement in the woods. I honestly wasn't all that concerned. The smell got stronger and stronger. I started to hear what I can't best describe as a dog panting. I decided I would investigate. I thought there was an animal that needed my help or something. I entered a clearing. The trees grew in a kind of dome shape, and the sun was heavily blocked out. I had to crawl through a tunnel of vines and thorns to get in. The ground was littered with animal bones. Large livestock, pets, birds, and small animals. There was a deer standing at the entrance. The smell was very, very intense at that point. This deer did not have a proper tail. It looked empty. I've always had a strong connection with animals, but this one felt off. I greeted the deer and placed my onions and flowers on the ground. I grabbed some bones by my feet and left. Starting from that experience, whenever I stayed at my grandmother's house, near the woods, animals I met acted strange. Birds of all kinds would follow me in the woods. I would smell that strange, sweet scent in the air and hear panting. At night, something would tap at the window. I always tapped back. I would have rats run up to me when I went to the garden. All of these animals had empty-looking tails. These strange things didn't stop when I moved. Recently, my dad got a job in closed mines and cave sites. He was regularly brought home pottery and other precious minerals from ancient Indian sites. I've kept these things in my room for safekeeping. I found a very large rib bone that has joined my collection as well. The day I started storing these things in my room is when things started to go downhill. My lights will dim and flicker. My animals will suddenly run out of the room. My pets have started staring into the corner I keep the artifacts in. I've had very, very strange dreams as well. all of them involving some of my stinky, wrinkly-tailed animal friends. Does anyone have any insight on what could be happening? I don't feel like in any danger, I just feel like I'm not always alone in my room anymore. Everything I've looked up about these animals has brought me here. I'm hoping someone can help me understand what is happening to me. I have been hesitant on posting any story, mainly due to the fact that I don't want anyone ever thinking that I, or the person the story is about, is crazy. Although saying this actually happened sounds very cliché, but I could assure you the following stories are true. Now, before I begin the first story, just for a bit of background, I am an intern for a church that does work on a Navajo reservation site, helping the community on people's homes like roof repairing, repainting, and interior fixing. 8 to 5, good pay, and nice people, so overall, I'm happy with this. And, as a bit of a disclaimer, I'm not trying to offend Navajo tradition in any way. This is just a first-hand story on what is currently happening on my trip. Over the past 2 months of the internship, I have begun to grow fairly close with some of the residents on the reservation. One lady in particular that I got to know pretty well was the superstitious type. Like said, never be outside at night or other random seeming things to me like that, but the biggest taboo I knew was to never mention, mainly because I was told by my superiors, was Navajo folklore like skinwalkers. However, one day it was very different in the sense that the question was just burning within me. I was on my lunch break after wrapping up painting parts of her house, and she sits next to me on her porch, and we talk for a while. But finally I feel comfortable enough to ask her about any folklore, about werewolves or anything of that sorts. I didn't really expect a response. I thought maybe she'd quickly say no and then change the topic. But if anything, I was more scared I may offend her. But to my surprise, she turns her head looking toward the outside scenery, hesitates, but then says, "Yes, I know some, and I've experienced it too." She proceeded to tell me a description on the apparent equivalent to a werewolf. To paraphrase what she said, werewolves look like normal people, but masked in white paint covering their face, arms, and chest. Their whole body as white as a corpse, covered with black symbols quite possibly related to devil worshipping. More specifically, they are gravediggers and necromancers as well. They dig bodies up only to steal jewelry, although they may perform other acts to corpses, as she quickly strayed away from going into too much detail about that point. Werewolves also get their power from the devil. That is how they are able to possess such supernatural strength and endurance. I was surprised to hear this, although I figured werewolves wouldn't look anything like that in Twilight or Scooby-Doo. Although deep down I thought she sounded a bit crazy. Before I could ask more questions about these werewolves, she began to tell me her own interaction with these supernatural beasts, and her story still gives me chills. She explained that one day, her and her husband were driving on the curvy roads alongside the mountains, only to find a woman with her face covered by her hands, and was kneeling in the middle of the road, appearing as though she was crying. The woman looks up towards the car's headlights to reveal the very same white paint and sacrificial symbols mentioned previously. Her husband honked his horn and quickly slams on the brakes, only to be too late, and he hears the loud cracking sound of the woman's bones and the splash of blood all over the windshield. Once her and her husband stopped the car safely and processed what the hell just happened, they quickly run over to the spot where they hit the woman. However, once they reached the spot, there was no body. But not only that, there was no trace of blood either. Just as a side note, this part of the reservation had some cliffs, but it was relatively flat land, so it would be obvious to tell where someone is, especially if they just got hit by a car. Puzzled by what the possible explanation could be for this occurrence, her and her husband drove back home, trying to neglect the thought that they just witnessed a werewolf. However, being the non-paranormal believers they were at the time, they tried to just close this occurrence off as them just losing their minds. As interesting as her story was, this got me thinking, is it possible for this werewolf story to be true? Or is this her own way of describing a skinwalker or other supernatural phenomenon because she didn't think I knew what a skinwalker was? This question kept circulating through my head. Shows you could expect, the following nights made it harder for me to sleep comfortably. Because of that, during the work days, I would feel more and more mentally drained, almost paranoid. At the end of week around 6, I think, I was sitting in the car driving back to the church site and was in the mental state of mind where I was half awake and half asleep. My buddy was driving and claimed that he wanted to pull over to the gas station that was near the church to grab a couple of snacks to munch on during our debrief time in our cabin. Since I was too tired to argue, I said fine and laid my face against the window and tried to doze off while waiting for my friend. However, I had the weirdest feeling that I was being watched. So naturally, I opened my eyes and looked out the window. I saw nothing. However, when I turned my head, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a white figure, just as the woman described previously. I looked back and nothing was there, but I swear I saw something. Since it was beginning to get darker outside, I quickly sat up in my seat to readjust my vision. But when I looked back out the window, it was almost as though the figure had vanished. Perplexed, I stepped outside the car and looked around, but there were no trace of a creature even existing. My buddy comes back to the car and questions what the hell I was doing. Debating whether or not I should tell him, I decided to just say, "Oh, I'm just getting some fresh air. Let's head out." The following days have been worse for me. My mood is getting worse. I'm feeling way more paranoid that something is out there. And at night, I can almost swear that I can hear screams in the far distance. Everything outside just looks 100 times scarier too because there's barely any outside light, just because of the moonlight. So everything has more of an exaggerated appearance. But believe me, I know I sound crazy, but the worst part is that if I tell anyone, they'll think I'm crazy too. So I've been debating whether or not I actually saw the werewolf that the lady described, or if it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I hope someone can find some sort of answer to this werewolf mystery. Also, if you have any similar paranormal stories like this, please tell me. I'm trying to do my best to become more aware about this kind of thing. If I can find anything, then I will give you a future update. I'm 17 years old and live in South Texas in a very small town on the countryside, where not much really goes on. Because of the lack of excitement in spring break, a friend of mine decided to throw a ranch party about 25 minutes out of town. Everything went well at the party and was a good time. At about 2 a.m., everything started winding down, and I thought I should be back and heading out soon. While driving back that night, out of nowhere a black cat entered the road and glared directly at me while its eyes lit up because of the headlights. With no time to react because of how sudden and close it was, I accidentally ran it over. I instantly felt eerie and bad about the whole situation and couldn't really take my mind off it for some odd reason. As I was arriving home, I parked my car into the carport and was determined to get inside as fast as possible. Before I could, though, I heard a deep, almost distorted laughter in the carport that had me really confused. With no hesitation, I quickly turned on the light and saw that the exact same black cat I had ran over sitting on the hood of my car. Something about its eyes didn't seem right and had me frozen with fear. I went inside as quick as possible and slept in my brother's room because of how freaked out I was. After doing some research, I came across skinwalkers and thought what I encountered might have been one, but I'm not too sure. What are your thoughts? I live next to a graveyard. Not sure how relevant that is, but just thought I'd throw that out there. But the other day, I was eating some lunch. Across the dining table is a back door with a screen door, and my dog that was next to me started growling, and I could see his hair standing up. So I looked to the door, which was open, but the screen was closed, and I see an owl standing right in front of it in broad daylight, just watching. I felt uneasy for some reason, but decided to walk up to the door because I've never seen an owl up close before, and it was very pretty. I stood there watching it as it watched me, and suddenly it opened its mouth very wide and just sat like that for about 30 seconds or so. I was confused, so I decided to tap the glass to see its reaction, and it just ran away, like on 2 feet, and ran in my wooden backyard. I was pretty freaked out, but I figured something had to be wrong with it. I decided to tell my sister, and she told me a couple nights ago she went out to her car in the front yard to roll herself a joint. She felt like she was being watched, so she looked up to see a deer standing right in front of her in the car and just watching her. She said even though deer are extremely common and we see them all the time, She felt afraid of it. She said something about its eyes freaked her out, and in the porch light, she could see it didn't have a tail. She slowly got out of the car and said it smelt horrible, like rotting flesh, so she ran to the door and locked it behind her. Also, one time her boyfriend was out on the back porch about to smoke a joint, but said he got spooked because he had a strange feeling and it smelt like something was rotting, so he went back inside. Do you think we should be concerned? There is a small community called Church Rock that is a few miles outside of Gallup, New Mexico. Many of the people that lived here have had land passed down many generations. This is where our story begins, 2 generations ago. There was a woman that was infatuated with a man in her community. She requested that the man build her a home. In exchange, she would give her daughter to the man to serve as his maid. The woman thought as the man worked on her home, she could woo him in the process. The deal was sealed and the man built the woman a house. The man collected his payment, but instead of having her daughter as a maid, he married her. The mother became enraged with jealousy and ran the newly married couple out of the community. The couple relocated to Ramah and started a new life. They had 6 children, 2 of which were twin girls. In the Navajo tradition, twins are seen as very powerful. In the mythology of the Navajos, the children of the sun were twins, and so they are held in very high regard. This is the story from one of those twin girls. The family began the construction on a new home. While they were building the house, the children would play outside as the adults worked. As they were playing, the older twin noticed an animal emerge from the woods. It was a coyote. Usually coyotes are very skittish and avoid humans at any cost. The coyote made its way closer to the girl. A strange smell filled the air, like something dead. The coyote came right up to her. She said that the coyote didn't bite her, but instead put its mouth over her mouth and began to suck the breath from her. It was at this point that she lost consciousness. One of the adults that was working on the house saw what was happening, and everyone rushed toward the coyote and the girl. The adults yelled and shouted as they ran towards them. The coyote darted back into the woods, and the girl fell to the ground. She was blue. The family worked fast and were able to resuscitate her. The incident resulted in the family going to see a medicine man. He told them that it was the grandmother, still harboring jealous feelings toward her own daughter and her family. They had a prayer done, and it was thought to be the end of it. Later, the family received news that the grandmother had died. As the years passed, construction on the home continued and the twin girls continued to grow. The family had built the first story of their home and moved in. The twin sisters shared a bedroom and slept together on a king-size bed. It was a hot summer night, and the family kept all the windows open to keep the rooms cold during the night. One night, the older twin arose to use the restroom. The family kept a small light on in the hallway. She got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and did her business. She returned to bed after that. As she was covering herself up, she happened to look up and froze in horror. There, at an open window, was a coyote, its eyes shining from the hallway light. The window was pretty high, and so the coyote had to have been standing on its rear legs. The girl was frozen with fear and made complete eye contact with the coyote. It was then that she noticed the same smell, the smell of death, rotting, and decay. She snapped and ran out of the room screaming and crying. She ran to her parents' room and got her father. He ran into the bedroom, half expecting it to be a figment of his daughter's imagination. But the strong smell hit him, and there was the same coyote still standing at the window. The father yelled and ran to get his rifle. The man ran out of his home, but the coyote was gone. The family tried to comfort the little girl, but she sobbed until morning. Again, the family sought out a medicine man. He explained to the family that the hatred that the grandmother had for the family was so strong that the ill intentions that she had had for the couple and their family proceeded even after the grandmother's death. When the family was blessed with twins, the grandmother knew of the strength it would bring the family, and so she wanted to get rid of one of them. The older twin recalls these events vividly and swears that the coyote that attempted to suffocate her and the one at her window were one and the same. Even the scent of death was familiar, the second time she encountered the creature. She hasn't seen it since that night and is very grateful for that. Summer of 2013. I'm driving a packed U-Haul through a remote section of the Navajo County with my 28-year-old daughter following her in her car. Middle of the night, pitch black, and the only radio station I can get was KTNN, which is the Navajo Nation. The DJ had been playing old school country, but switched it up, and suddenly the cab of the truck was filled with the otherworldly sounds of the Bear Creek Singers. We had just passed the turnoff to the ghost town of Zenith. Nobody lives out there. It's just devoid of life. All I could see was the road illuminated by the headlights, and that insane music filling my mind. We're doing about 70, and suddenly, he was right in front of me. The next couple seconds goes like this. There, illuminated in the headlights, is a figure on all fours, walking across the highway directly in front of my speeding truck. In place of arms and legs, this creature had 4 long sticks, and the body was draped in a colorful Navajo-style blanket. No head, just those sticks moving back and forth, slowly propelling him across the road in the middle of the night. I swerved the truck and just missed him. Looked in the rear view and saw him in my approaching daughter's headlights. Then watched her car make the same last-second maneuver to avoid running him over. I was stunned and just kept driving, and reassured that she was still behind me. 30 minutes later, we pulled up to her new digs in Snowflake, Arizona, and her first words to me was, "What the fuck was that?" For the record, she is an LDS and almost never swears. Since that night, I myself have moved to Snowflake and driven that same lonely stretch of the 277 fairly often at night, but never while listening to KTNN for fear of creating conditions that would result in a repeat of the incident. I inquired with my native friends up here, and the only advice was, don't tell that story anymore. So, I still think gods, superstitions, and everything else is BS, but what will go to my grave believing native culture holds powerful secrets the rest of us don't understand? Skinwalkers are real, and apparently they like to mess with ignorant whites like me. Appreciate any feedback because, like I mentioned, our native friends won't discuss it with us, and nobody believes me except my kid. Oh, and I'm now a big fan of native drum ceremonies. I swear, on the highest honor I can muster, that everything in this story is true, related as lucidly as possible, all true no matter how badly I wish it wasn't. There isn't much to do in the rural parts of Pennsylvania, what some call Pennsyltucky. Like most parts of rural America, popular pastimes include drinking oneself into a stupor and driving unsuspected 1983 Ford F-150s double the speed limit down narrow, rarely maintained roads. I, however, occupy myself when I can by hunting. It gets a bad rap as barbaric, cruel, and just downright mean, but I've always found solace in the forest that it's impossible to find in the cramped, too close for comfort atmosphere of a small town. This particular season, I was out in early November in a forest in the foothills of the Appalachians, a few minutes away from my home northwest of Harrisburg. It was late in the fall season, and the steady flow of foliage tourists, what locals call leaf peepers, was beginning to trickle to a stop. Some trees were still burning a fiery red-orange, but most were beginning to wither, foreshadowing an unusually harsh winter. The falling leaves created a curtain of decay which moved like a sandstorm in slow motion, shrouding and isolating me from my surroundings and crunching softly under every footstep. I paced through the temple of red and gold, alert for the light footsteps of my quarry, white-tailed deer. My Winchester 30-06 swayed on my back as I walked. The gun was overkill for a deer, but it doesn't pay to take chances around bigger game like elk and black bear. This forest was new territory for me, a refreshing change of pace after paved trails and subdivisions began to encircle the hunting grounds of my childhood. As I walked, I began to lighten my guard, losing focus on wildlife and becoming engrossed in the natural beauty of the area. I became so distracted, peering up at the falling leaves, that I tripped over a tree root, snaking through the carpet. I followed it with my eyes to its termination at the base of a massive gnarled oak tree. The trunk was huge, but the tree was squat, blackened with age and split down the middle, as if by an act of God. This story could have ended then and there if not for a smell that wafted up to me as I passed the tree. It wound its way up from the tree's base, out of a swale in the ground, to the raised path I was walking on. Fishing the crisp smell of the forest aside, my first thought was that of a dead animal, which could mean bear in the area, so I encircled the tree to take a look. There was no carcass, but the scene at the base of the tree resembled a homicide. Dark, matted clumps of fur dotted the undergrowth, and a vicious black fluid led from the forest into a hollow overshadowed by a titanic root, leading deep into the ground. The entire picture was punctuated by the smell of rank, a thick, coppery scent like pennies mixed with death. I am not unused to gritty, even downright disturbing scenes, but this scent made me retch involuntarily, and the den unsettled me deeply, as though I had stumbled upon something no one should have ever seen. Shaken, I moved back onto the trail and, against my better judgment, resumed my search for a deer. The sun began to beat down overhead with all the clarity of a winter's day, shining a demanding light on the forest and weakening my resolve. I had just begun to unpack my lunch when something began to bother me. I couldn't put a finger on what it was, but I felt antsy, for lack of a better word, like I shouldn't be sitting still. Without even knowing it, I began to scan my surroundings for something, anything. I was returning to my lunch when it hit me. The forest was silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Even the rustle of the trees in the wind had come to an ominous standstill. As the meaning of this realization began to sink in and I got to my feet, two things happened in rapid succession. A sizable branch snapped a few hundred meters away, and an ungodly screech penetrated the November air. I have never heard a sound like it before or since. It was as though the earth itself split and hell opened up, just long enough to sum up the suffering of the damned in one ear-splitting roar. Terrified, I bolted to my gun, leaned against a tree and began to scan the undergrowth. Something big was moving through the forest floor, but I couldn't see what it was, thanks to the curtain of leaves falling around me. I hastily made tracks back in the direction I had come, forcing myself not to look back. After all, what animal would actively stalk a human without even being provoked? I had lost the sound of the creature and begun to loosen up a little when I was hit with a bone-chilling realization. The sounds of forest had come back behind me, but the trees in front were as silent of the grave. Whatever I had encountered, probably the same beast that made the mess under the oak tree, had circled back in an attempt to trap me. Truly scared at this point, I scrambled off the path into a rock gully, my back to a damp rock wall. I crawled without taking my eyes off the path into a cave, hoping to hide my hyperventilation and chattering teeth from whatever was stalking me. Only a few minutes had passed when I heard the crunch of leaves and a deep, demonic snorting. It stopped on the path above my hideaway, and I held my breath, willing my heart to stop so as to be completely silent. The creature had begun to move on when my gun, leaning against a rock, slipped off the slick surface. It clattered to the ground, reverberating louder than an air raid siren in the crisp autumn air. My heart sank as I heard steps make their way down the rocks and closer to me. I crawled painfully slow towards my rifle, every muscle in my body tight enough to burst. I stopped to steady myself and heard breathing, right outside the cave opening. It was choked, slavering breathing, unnatural breathing which inspired visualizations of twisted corruptions of human and beast, a patchwork demon of animal and man. I reached for my gun and came the closest to death I ever have, because as I outstretched my hand, so did it. Instead of the smooth shellac of my rifle stock, my palm met a coarse, ragged fur caked with mud and attached to a lengthy, sinewy arm. The beast screamed, and as I shouldered my rifle and fired blindly out of the opening, I caught a glimpse of a yellowed fang and one blood-red eye, an eye that reflected a hatred more ancient than man, a hatred that said, "This is my forest. You may have altered it through your presence, corrupted it, but I was here before you, and I will be here after you." Human willpower paled in the face of such uncompromising malice, and I shrank back against the rocks, robotically cycling bullets out of the cave. I sat there, dead-eyed, doing this for a long time, overnight and well into the next morning. Over 18 hours of working a bolt and pulling a trigger. By the time I snapped out of my adrenaline-fueled haze, my mouth felt like a desert, and my fingers felt as though they were made out of canvas stretched over dust. Shaking, I reached for my water bottle and gulped it down, spilling most of it down my front. Praying the beast was long gone, I inched my way out of the cave and ran as fast as my rickety legs would carry me, the 2 odd miles back to my truck, leaving most of my gear behind. Nothing pursued me, but the feeling of being hunted remained. I drove back to town at 80 miles per hour on a dirt road, my eyes wide with fear and my hands gripping the wheel with white knuckles. Unable to bear the thought of my secluded home, I spent the night at a motel in town with a bottle of cheap whiskey and every light in the room turned on. The thought of the creature would not exit my mind. Was it a demon loosed on Earth by some divine mistake? Or just an animal, a cryptid lost to time and the memories of the trees? I didn't really want to know, but I couldn't and still can't let it go. The fear eventually subsided, but as I sit at home writing this, I swear, hand to God, that I can hear a howl echo through the trees and across the mountains, telling me that I may never rest and never forget.